The risk is that it's seen by the authorities as being a trend. There is a risk that some police forces will essentially panic and they'll make things worse. When we talk about organised football violence, we generally talk about groups that gather together before a match with the intention that they may get involved in violence on the way to or the way from the match, and they'll put themselves, this group, in positions where that violence may occur. So, for example, they will take over a pub of a rival firm as a challenge, or they will try to march past that rival firm's pub. But in the UK, that tends to be where it stops. We don't tend to get fans that will say, look, we're going to have a fight on this car park at this time on this day. And in other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, they do that quite regularly. So they will say, right, well, hang on a minute, we're the firm of, I don't know, Spartak Moscow. We want to have a fight with the firm of Lokomotiv Moscow. We're going to fight on a non-match day in this car park at midnight because we know the police aren't going to be there. In the UK, it's exceptionally rare that you would see that. Really, really rare.
How does the scene in the United Kingdom compare to other parts of Europe?
So the UK got the reputation as being the home of football hooliganism in the 1970s and 1980s. Prior to that, it had always been assumed that it was the Latin Americans and the Southern Europeans that were the real firebrands, and actually UK fans were incredibly civilized. Then sort of in the 70s and 80s, it was the UK that got that reputation. It's not been the case that the UK is a home of hooliganism or that UK football fans are more violent than other fans for a long time now, certainly not for any point this century. And now much more serious violence takes place in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in Southern Europe. So, Poland, Hungary, Russia, Belgium, Holland, Italy, increasingly France, all have much more serious problems than the UK.
I guess what's the point?
What's the point in engagement in football violence? Well, there's a number of different explanations. There isn't one simple explanation because ultimately even people that engage in football violence don't engage in football violence all the time at every match. That's the first thing to understand. The vast bulk of matches take place perfectly peacefully. So you will have groups that want to engage in violence simply because they enjoy what it delivers to them personally. And that may be a psychological buzz, or it may be social currency, maybe individual reputation in their locality or in their fan group. Or it may be that they feel that that is the way that they need to represent their locality or represent their particular club. So there are individual reasons why people engage in that. But yeah, the vast bulk of major football disorders, so those sort of major riots that we see from time to time, are almost always caused by a breakdown in crowd management. Okay, it's that the police have done something wrong. They've made a mistake, or the crowd security at the stadium have done something wrong. And that has essentially caused a minor incident of disorder or violence to exacerbate, which draws in fans who didn't have that predisposition to violence, that weren't there to fight, but suddenly feel like they are under attack.
But you observed from the inside, right? Were you in a firm or?
So the method that I chose to investigate football crowd behaviour and football crowd regulation was to go covertly undercover inside football crowds where I knew issues occurred.
What was that kind of experience like?
Well, it was fascinating. It was exciting. It was occasionally scary, but mostly the disorder and violence that you saw was brief. There were not many people involved. It was fairly easy to stay away from. The biggest danger, personally, was always posed by the police, particularly away from the UK when I went to places like Italy or France with English football teams. We were subject to very aggressive, violent policing. That was always the biggest risk and where I felt the most uncomfortable.
Now, did you have to kind of do anything to be a part of that crowd or just kind of go along with the crowd?
Mostly, I could just hang around in the crowd and act as they did, which was almost always in a non-violent manner. There were occasions during my early research where I had to commit very minor criminal offences, which I've talked about and published about. For example, running on a football pitch, which is a criminal offence in the UK, or being drunk inside a football stadium. And if I didn't do that, then I would basically be excluded from the group I was researching. But mostly, the amount of actual fights I ended up in and the amount of times I actually had to throw a punch in self-defense was, could count on the fingers of one hand in 25 years of doing this work.
I'm a big numbers person, and say on a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is the most peaceful community of happy fans that you could imagine and 10 is the 1980s, like where do you think we are currently on that scale?
Oh, maybe 3.
That's like, it's not going to happen to you, but you know that you have to be aware that it is there.
Yeah, and I think the to put it in its context, I think pre-lockdown we were at a 2. So there has been a post-lockdown increase.
Do you think that, does that mean that, is that a trend where we're going to be going back up, or is that kind of just like, all right, the pandemic is lifting for the most part, at least socially, in terms of social gathering, and this is a temporary thing, or do you think, okay, we're ramping back up here?
So I think if we keep doing what we've been doing, particularly I'm talking from the UK here, if we keep doing what we're doing in terms of good crowd management, I think it's just a blip. I think the self-regulation and self-policing among fan groups will re-establish itself, and I think the good football policing operations will also re-establish themselves and things will calm down. The risk is that it's seen by the authorities as being a trend, and it's seen that the previous things we were doing weren't working, and that therefore we need to up the stakes in terms of, for example, the number of police officers, the aggression of those police officers. And if we do that, then the risk is that you're going to make the situation worse. So it has the potential to get worse. I don't think we'll ever go back to where we were in the 1970s or 1980s, because I think things are just so much better now in terms of stadium infrastructure, legal infrastructure, and expertise of police officers. But there is a risk that some police forces will essentially panic and they'll make things worse.